I have a number of times pointed out that the book of Esther is all about the sovereignty of God. And I have also made it clear that God's sovereignty is exercised in two basic ways. First of all, he uses his servants to bring about his sovereign purposes. And secondly, he bypasses any human agency and uses what we call providence, that is, the circumstances, to fulfill his purposes. But either way, the sovereignty of God is at work. And I mention that first because this passage is an excellent example of how God first uses Esther herself to bring about what he wants to happen, but secondly, he acts quite independently of Esther through providence in a number of examples. So we're going to look at this passage, and I'm using three headings, which is to help us find our way through and follow the argument. And the three headings are, first of all, Esther's denunciation, secondly, the king's distress, and finally, Haman's death. Now, denunciation is a big word, but it really is the only word that represents what Esther set about doing at this second feast. It talks about the second day. And it does that because there had been a similar feast held the previous day, where Esther invited Haman and the king as her only guests to have a meal with her. So it was, in fact, a lunchtime meal. And Esther's purpose on that first occasion, previous day, was to really find out how far the king trusted Haman. You see, Haman had been appointed by the king as prime minister of the Persian Empire. He was second only in power and authority to the king himself. And Esther wanted to bring before the king a plea that Haman's edict, which had been published to destroy and annihilate the Jews throughout the empire, he was going to plead with the king to stop that happening. But she didn't know whether the king, in fact, would support her or Haman. That first feast, the day before the events described in this passage, was a means by which she satisfied herself that the king was far from happy with the ambitious ideas that Haman had, and had in fact discovered that Haman did not have the service of the king as his prime objective, but the possession of more power. So she was satisfied from the first feast that the second occasion would be suitable to reveal the problem to the king and to plead for Haman's edict to be in some way overruled or set aside. And last time I spoke, I had to do a review of the first 6 chapters because some of our audience, some of our congregation on that occasion had no knowledge of the book of Esther. So I, in fact, set aside my detailed exegesis of the passage, and we did a review. And that went down very well. But we're going back now to a more detailed study of the text and digging into it to discover the deeper things that God reveals through his word. So let's begin with Esther's denunciation. The word, if you could help in the dictionary, means a public statement that somebody is evil and is wrong or bad. It's a public declaration by one person about another. And to be public, says the dictionary, it only needs one person, one audience, one person as an audience. You don't have to have a crowd to make a public proclamation. One person makes a crowd in this context. And so Esther is about to denounce Haman and his edict, his murderous plot to annihilate the Jews from the empire. But there was an interesting approach that she took. They all sat down for this second meal, and I think Haman was rather relieved that his invitation had not been cancelled, because after the events of the morning, when he was forced by the king to lead a horse, the king's horse, through the streets of Shushan, with Mordecai seated on that horse, dressed in the king's robe. And, of course, Mordecai was the bitter enemy of Haman. And Haman was forced not only to lead the horse through the streets, but to cry out so that the people could hear that this is the man, the one on the horse, that is, Mordecai. This is the horse, this is the man that the king delights to honor. Perhaps he was honoring the horse as well, but Mordecai was the object of the king's pleasure. And that was a bitter pill for Haman to take. He was absolutely shattered by this, and he was humiliated, and the king had deliberately brought about that humiliation because he had discovered that Haman's chief object in life was to gain power rather than to serve the king. And so he goes home. Haman goes home. And he no doubt was looking for comfort and support from his family. But he got neither. He went home, and this is what he got. I'm going to read it. It's back in chapter 6. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, talking about the humiliation to which he had been subjected, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Now, I just want to say two things about that. First of all, they were pagans, idol worshippers, probably, and yet they recognized that if Mordecai was a Jew, Haman couldn't win. Now, what was different about Jews? Why did these idol worshippers say that if Mordecai is a Jew, or is it of Jewish descent? Well, the only thing that was different about Jews from other tribes in the empire was simply that they believed in a sovereign God who was active in the affairs of men. And that is something that these idol worshippers recognized. They recognized that the God of the Jews was a sovereign, powerful God who acted and brought about his own desires among men. And that is a tremendous acknowledgement of the existence and reality and power of the God of the Bible, even uttered by unbelievers. And there are times in our experience when that happens, when unbelievers have to and are forced to recognize that God exists and that God is at work in the world, something to the glory of God. Now, the second lesson that we can draw from this situation is that the Bible's teaching is uniformly, everywhere and all the time, uniformly, that you should support members of your family. The family is the central unit of humanity, of civilization, if you like. And we should rightly, from our families, get support and comfort and assistance and help, even if we are at fault and we have to be rebuked. That rebuke has the purpose of restoration, not of condemnation. And this is a great thing for us to remember. We are to take care, basically, of our family. There are so many quotations in the Bible that I'm only going to give you one, and that is in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, where the Apostle Paul writes, "If anyone does not provide for his relatives, for his family, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And that's a New Testament injunction. It reminds us that we have a responsibility to God to care for our families, to help our relatives, to be available, to be sympathetic when things go wrong, and, of course, to rejoice with them when things go well. And that applies not only to our human families, but to our spiritual families, to a church, to a local church. Our desire should always be to help our fellow believer, because that is a family. The church, the local church, is a family. And that family needs the care one for another, because, as Lord is somewhere else, that we are members one of another. That's in Ephesians, I think. So there we are. That's lessons from a negative reaction. But let's now move on to the text of chapter 7, where we're told that after drinks, Esther made her request. You see, that the king the previous day had said, "Oh, what do you want from me? I'll give you half my kingdom if you ask for it." And all Esther had said was, "No, I just want another meal, like today, tomorrow, with Haman and yourself as guests." And so this was the second feast on the following day. And Esther was prepared then to denounce Haman and the edict he had organized and written himself to destroy the Jews. But you will notice that she is very careful of what she said and how she said it. She said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted to me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." But you notice that she doesn't mention Haman, and she doesn't mention the Jews. And that really was quite vital. Because if she had mentioned either Haman or the Jews, the king would immediately have remembered that he himself had given Haman permission and power to kill off the Jews. And now, Haman had tricked him, because he represented the Jews throughout the empire as a rebellious people who wouldn't obey the king's laws. Well, that was nonsense. There's nothing to stop us today obeying the law of the land and obeying the Bible. We do both. And they, no doubt, did both. But by misrepresenting the Jews, he persuaded the king to let him kill off this tribe that wasn't named. He didn't name them as the Jews. He said that there is a people, there is a tribe who don't obey the laws of the land and ought to be killed off. Well, now, when she broaches her request to the king on this second occasion, she is careful not to identify either the perpetrator or the victims, because had she done so, the king would immediately have remembered that something like 3 months before, he had given Haman authority and indeed power to do this exactly. And so the king would have been placed in a very, very difficult position, because he was in some degree responsible for the problem that Esther was asking him to solve. And to avoid that happening, in which case, of course, if it had happened, we don't really know how the king would have behaved, but he would have said, well, I'll think about it, or let's talk about it another time, or whatever. He would not have granted her wish, but on this occasion, he's going to grant her wish, up to half his kingdom. He's going to be very generous towards her, and he is focusing on an unidentified enemy who wants to kill off an unidentified people. Now, of course, Esther says, me and my people are being threatened with extinction. But you see, Esther had not revealed to the king that she was a Jew. Mordecai had specifically told her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. He had brought her up as his own child, but the king saw her as an orphan who happened to have been adopted by a Jew, but that didn't make her a Jew. He did not recognize there was any blood relationship between Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai had insisted throughout, don't tell anyone that you are a Jew. And so when she says, me and my people, that wasn't giving anything away. The king was, in a sense, in a vacuum. He was angry. He was angry, but there was no specific target for his anger. He was angry because something had been going on, a plot had been hatched in his empire that he knew nothing about, because he wasn't connecting this in any way with the permission he had given to Haman earlier. He was thinking of some unknown, undefined people who were threatened with death. And so she was very careful not to give the king a target for his anger. So what was he angry about? Well, he was angry, first of all, I think, because something was happening in his empire that he knew nothing about. Now, nobody could rule an empire of 127 former nations or city-states without an extremely effective spy network. There was peace throughout that empire. Internally, there was peace. It was a very, very well-run empire. And in order to maintain peace, I am sure the king had to have spies throughout the empire, spies in every province, people who had their eyes and ears open to pick up any potential trouble. But that had failed him here, you see. He says, here is a plot that he's hearing about for the first time from the lips of Esther. And he was angry that things were going on that he didn't know about. He was possibly angry because if there was a plot to destroy one ethnic group, then that would mean trouble in the empire. There would be civil war, perhaps, between different groups in the empire. There would be resistance by one group. And the peace of the empire in which I'm sure he prided himself would be destroyed. So he'd be cross about that, be angry about that. And then finally, of course, his wife was involved. And he didn't know what ethnic group she belonged to, but she was obviously one of those that was destined for annihilation if her petition was rejected. I think that was an example of God exercising his sovereignty through a servant, through Esther. I mean, Esther was a very intelligent woman, but I do not think she would have thought this one out and realized the danger of identifying the perpetrator and the victims straight away. She wanted the king to be angry, but she wanted the king to be angry in a general sense. She wanted to work up his anger so that by the time she did reveal that it was Haman and the Jews who were concerned, he would have still been angry, and his focus of anger would have been Haman. And that is how it happened. Now, I don't think that Esther would have thought out that strategy. And I think that was a case where God was putting thoughts into her mind. He was working out his sovereign will through the servant. But presently we're going to see some examples of he bypassed Esther completely, and he acted in providence to bring about his purposes. Now, the other thing we need to note about her initial response is this statement that my people, this is 7 verse 4, my people, we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. But then she carried on, if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. I wouldn't have troubled you for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Now, Haman's edict said nothing about being sold. And there are occasions when today we would use the concept of being sold as a kind of metaphor. Sometimes we use the expression sold down the river, meaning we've been cheated and we're being led into situations that we don't want to. Or sold a pup. I don't know whether you've ever heard that. There's an old Scottish saying, I think, sold a pup. And that was based upon the idea that you would buy a pig in a bag, and when you open the bag, you find you didn't have a pig, you had a puppy, which is of much lower value. So that we do use this idea of being sold in a metaphorical sense. But I do not think you'll find any example in the Bible where this word sold is used in a metaphorical sense. It meant literally sold. And I think that what Esther saw and understood was that Haman's plan, although it didn't mention this, that Haman's plan was in fact a two-stage process. First of all, her people, the Jews, had been sold for money. And the only entity that could sell citizens of the empire was the empire itself, the state, and therefore the king. And it was well known, actually, in those days that countries would sell their citizens to neighboring countries simply to raise money. They sell them into slavery in neighboring countries. And you see, this idea of being sold into slavery is present in our verse. We have been sold to be destroyed and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I wouldn't have protested. We'd have put up with it. We somehow handled it as an ethnic community within the empire. It would be terrible for us, and we'd have to find some way to work around it, but I wouldn't have troubled the king. But there was a second stage, and that was once somebody had bought a slave, if that slave did not obey implicitly every order of the master, it was quite legal for the master to kill him or her. And I think this is how Mordecai and Esther saw Haman's plot, Haman's plan. First of all, remember, Haman gave a lot of money to the king's treasury for the permission to take over the future and fate of the Jews. I think it was a vast sum of money, 50 talents of silver. And Haman had bought the Jewish people from the state, from the king, essentially. And then, because Haman was now their slave master, and because they would undoubtedly continue worshipping their God and not Haman himself, he would have a good and, quotes, legal reason for killing them all. And so there was a subtlety about Haman's plan to annihilate the Jewish people that was invisible, I think, to most people except Mordecai and Esther. Well, then, that was a good reason why Esther did not want to identify the enemy or the victims outright to begin with. The king would have been shocked, of course, to learn that his wife belonged to this unspecified lawless faction. But his anger, if any, would have been directed against the queen, not Haman, for keeping him in the dark about membership of that group. He still didn't know who they were, of course. Well, then we come on to our second point, the king's distress. When he says, who is this person who is plotting this thing in my empire without my knowledge? Who is this? And she said, it's this wicked Haman. He was sitting there, three of them were there, King, Haman, and Esther. It is the wicked Haman who has sold us into, who has not sold us, wicked Haman who has planned our destruction and annihilation. What was the king's reaction? I call this part the king's distress. Because now the king realized that he was part of the problem. He realized that he had permitted and empowered Haman to deal with this unspecified tribe, and he didn't know that tribe was the Jews until Haman's edict was published, 3 months after the permission was granted. And, of course, he still didn't know that Esther was a Jew. But he was angry when Haman was named as the enemy, the plotter, the perpetrator. And he was absolutely angry. And my question is, why did he not say anything at all? He just walked out into the garden. If you look at the text carefully, you'll see that when Haman was named by Esther as the enemy, the king didn't say a thing, didn't say a word, just walked out into the garden. Now, why did the king do that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Yes, he was very angry with Haman, but he was angry with himself as well, because now he recognized that he was at fault in handing over the fate of this unknown tribe to Haman in the first place. And so he didn't know what to say. If he had expressed his anger to Haman at that moment, if he had taken Haman apart, as it were, in his anger at the moment, Haman had a ready defense. Haman could have said, well, just a minute. You gave me the permission. You gave me the power. You knew all about it. It's just as much your fault as it is mine. And of course the king would not have had any answer to that. So to avoid that, the king walks out into the garden. Doesn't say a word. Goes out into the garden. I didn't have to do that. And here I see the providence of God at work. The sovereignty of God expressed in providence, in the control of events. Nothing to do with Esther. Esther didn't have anything to do with him walking out into the garden. But he walked out into the garden. And when he got into the garden, he obviously did some thinking, some hard thinking. He said, look, I am implicated in this problem. I'm implicated in a plot to kill off the Jews, and my wife must therefore be a member of the Jewish clan, as it were. I'm in a terrible situation. I am in a very distressing situation. And in the garden, he must have come to some conclusion. He must have come to some answer, to some way of dealing with this the severe embarrassment that was caused by his implication. But then he came back. And he came back into the room. And we never know, we never knew, and we shall never know what decisions he had come to out in the garden, because as he walked back into the house, he found that Haman had thrown himself onto the couch where Esther was laying. I may have tripped up and fallen, I don't know, but he was pleading with Esther for his life. But the king saw him and completely misunderstood what he was doing there. And the king must have given some sign, because one of his servants at that moment said, behold, there is a gallows that Haman had built in his own garden for the execution of Mordecai. And king said, hang him on that. And so they covered the head of Haman. which was a sign of the death sentence. They carried him out and they hung him, killed him. And that was the end of Haman. And we're told that the king's anger subsided. Now, I just want to finish by summarizing really what we've learned from this situation. I'll just read the text as it comes to us from the Bible. As the word, let's go one verse earlier, verse 8. Misunderstanding what he saw, he declared, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? Well, because he wasn't assaulting her, he was pleading with her for her life. But he finished up, in some way, leaning across her as she lay on the couch. And that was a misunderstanding by the king. As the word left the king's mouth, they, his servants, covered Haman's face, a sign that he was condemned to death. And verses 9 to 10, Haman is hanged on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. And the conclusion of all that is simply this, that Haman's wife was right. You cannot fight God and win. He came back just at the critical moment. If he'd spent another 5 minutes in the garden or less, he might not have found Haman in that compromising position. Haman might have been standing up. He might have been kneeling before Esther, but not leaning on her, not covering her body. Had the timing been different, then the king would not have misunderstood what he saw. Probably Haman would have finished up dead anyway, but nevertheless, there was God's providence at work in the timing of the king's departure and return. And there was no further conversation. Haman had nothing to say, no opportunity to plead, no opportunity to explain why he was in that posture that he was, because clearly the king gave his servant some signal, and they covered his head, and he was condemned to death. But really the message for us is that you cannot fight God and win. I remind you of her words from chapter 6 and verse 13. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Prophetic words based upon the fact that Mordecai was a believer in and a servant of the God of the Bible. And of course that must have general application for us today. Whatever happens, whatever circumstances, whatever problems there are in the world or in our personal lives or in our church or whatever, the devil is at work, seeking to undermine the gospel, seeking to make people believe that Christ didn't exist, seeking to destroy the testimony of the church. People sometimes even in the church, not this church, but large churches may have people who are within the church who set out to destroy the church. Paul warns the Ephesians about this in Acts 20. And so we have this situation that we serve a sovereign God, one who does all things according to the counsel, the wisdom of his will. And this is something for us to be profoundly grateful for, and it gives us confidence to continue when things go hard for us. Confidence to trust in God through thick and thin. Confidence to believe in a God who is sovereign and whose purposes will win, will be fulfilled. That's something to take out, keep upon our hearts.